You gave your heart to someone who didn't see your worth at the time. He had a choice, and he chose wrong. Maybe he picked someone easier, flashier, or just didn't think you were the one. At first, it might have looked like he was winning, but here's the thing about regret. It doesn't show up when everything feels exciting and new. It shows up when the truth finally sinks in, when he realizes what he walked away from, when he sees the difference between what he thought he wanted and what he actually needed. This is the moment he realizes he didn't just lose you, he lost something real. He chose comfort over connection, and for a while, it seemed like the right decision. It felt easier, no tension, no challenge, no deep emotional work required, just someone who was there, available, agreeable, safe. And in the moment, that seemed appealing. Real connection can be uncomfortable because it asks something of you. It pushes you to grow, to be emotionally honest, to be present, vulnerable, and accountable. When he was with you, he might have felt a spark he couldn't explain, one that made him feel alive and a little unsettled all at once. But he didn't realize that feeling wasn't a warning sign, it was exactly what he needed. The person he chose didn't challenge him, she didn't ask him to open up or think deeper. There were no tough conversations that made him look at himself. Everything was on the surface. It felt smooth, predictable, easy. And for someone who wasn't ready to face his emotional blind spots, that seemed like the smart move. Why stay in something that feels complex when you can opt for what feels instantly gratifying? But the truth is, comfort without connection eventually starts to feel hollow. There's only so long someone can live on autopilot before they start to feel the ache of what's missing. At first, he might have dismissed it, thinking he was just in a rut or needed more excitement in his routine. But that low-level dissatisfaction kept returning. It whispered to him in the quiet moments. Something didn't feel right. Something was off, and eventually he realized it wasn't just about where he was, it was about who he was with. He began to think about the way you looked at him, the way you saw him, even in his worst moments, how you understood parts of him he didn't even know how to explain. The way your connection wasn't just about shared interests or attraction, it was about energy, authenticity, and emotional intimacy. You didn't let him hide, and deep down, a part of him loved that about you. But he wasn't ready to be fully seen. He mistook that depth for drama or too much intensity, so he went where it was quieter, thinking that peace meant compatibility. Now that silence has become deafening. He can't talk to the person he's with about what really matters to him. There's no spark, no shared language of the soul. Just routines and roles. He starts to miss how your conversations made him feel, alive, inspired, understood. He remembers the way you challenged him, not to be someone else, but to be more of who he truly is. That memory doesn't go away, it lingers. It shows up when he sees someone who reminds him of you, or when he catches himself repeating the same dull patterns. And this is when regret hits. Not in a dramatic moment, but in the slow realization that he didn't choose what was right for him. He chose what was safe. He confused peace with absence of challenge and comfort with compatibility. He didn't see that connection is messy sometimes because real closeness requires effort. But once you've had real connection, once you've tasted it, nothing else feels the same. And the saddest part? He knows he had it, and he let it go. He underestimated your value, and at the time, he didn't even realize he was doing it. He saw you, he liked you, maybe even cared about you, but he didn't fully grasp who you were or what you brought into his life. Not because you weren't showing it, but because he wasn't looking deeply enough. He thought he had time. He thought you'd always be there. Or maybe he thought someone else would come along who was somehow more exciting, more low mental, more whatever he convinced himself he needed. What he didn't realize was that what you gave him wasn't ordinary. It wasn't something people hand out to just anyone. You showed up, you gave your energy, your loyalty, your trust. You supported him in ways that went beyond the surface. You believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. You listened, not just to his words, but to the silence in between them. You cared about the details. You remembered the small things. You didn't just want to be with him. You wanted to understand him. That kind of emotional investment is rare, but when someone is used to attention or hasn't done the work to truly appreciate emotional depth, they can mistake that kind of love as something standard. He didn't see that what you offered wasn't something he could easily replace. He may have thought he was keeping his options open, playing it cool, not getting in too deep. Maybe he saw you as too available or thought he could find someone with fewer expectations. He might have convinced himself that he was making a logical decision by not choosing you fully. But logic means nothing when you're standing in front of a soul that sees you, really sees you, and you walk away. That's not clarity, that's fear. It's a lack of emotional maturity to recognize value that isn't loud or flashy, because the truth is, value isn't always obvious to the untrained eye. It's often quiet, consistent, steady, and if someone hasn't learned to slow down and pay attention, they'll miss it completely. Eventually something shifts. He starts to notice that what he now has with others doesn't compare. The conversations feel shallow, the support feels conditional, the attention feels transactional. No one else gets him the way you did. No one else shows up with the same sincerity. And suddenly all the things he took for granted become clear. The way you used to check in when he was off. The way you gave without keeping score. The way your presence brought calm to his chaos. These things weren't weaknesses, they were strengths. And now he sees it, but it's too late. Regret creeps in slowly. It shows up in the little moments. When he scrolls through old messages, when he hears a song that reminds him of you, when something good happens and he instinctively wants to share it with you, but you're not there anymore. That's when he starts to realize your value, not just what you did for him, but who you were. And more than that, how rare someone like you actually is. He thought you'd always be an option. He thought there'd be another chance. But when someone underestimates your value, they don't just risk losing you. They risk learning the hardest lesson of all, that someone can be everything you needed, but if you don't recognize it when it's in front of you, they'll become the one that got away. And that kind of realization doesn't fade. It stays, because the moment you walk away, fully, completely, and without looking back, is the moment he finally sees your worth. But by then, it's only in hindsight. He chased the superficial and ignored the substance. And for a while, he thought he was winning. He chose someone who looked good on paper, maybe someone who turned heads, said all the right things, made him feel admired or validated in public. She checked the boxes that the world told him mattered. Attractive, fun, maybe even easygoing or low minimum. But he didn't pause to ask himself whether she truly saw him, challenged him, or matched him on a deeper emotional level. He went after the image, not the connection. And when the image started to crack, he began to see the truth. When he was with you, the connection wasn't just physical or social. It was rooted in real emotional substance. You talked about things that mattered. You didn't just reflect his ego back to him. You held up a mirror to who he really was. You called out his potential, not to control him, but because you wanted to see him grow. You were interested in his mind, his past, his values. There was a depth in the way you engaged with him, a kind of energy that couldn't be fake. But at the time, he didn't value that. He didn't understand the difference between being wanted and being understood. Superficial attraction is easy to chase. It feeds the part of him that wants approval, attention, and status. It makes him feel momentarily powerful, desirable, admired. But those feelings are temporary and they require constant upkeep. Over time, the conversations start to feel repetitive. The laughter feels forced. He begins to realize that when he strips away the looks or the lifestyle, there's nothing holding the relationship together. There's no emotional intimacy, no deep trust, no real friendship underneath the surface. That's when the contrast starts to haunt him. He thinks back to you, not just your presence, but how he felt around you, grounded, real, at ease. Even when things weren't perfect, there was honesty. There was room to be himself. You weren't trying to impress him. You were showing up with authenticity. He didn't have to perform or hide. And at the time, he mistook that for something too serious, too emotional, maybe even too intense. But now that same intensity feels like something he desperately misses, because nothing shallow can replicate the richness of emotional depth. It's not that the person he chose was wrong in the sense of being bad. It's that she wasn't right in the ways that matter long term. She might have been fun in the moment, but she didn't challenge him to grow. She didn't get inside his head or open his heart. And now he's starting to see how empty the chase really was. He realizes he was measuring the wrong things. He was too focused on the outside, and he missed what was happening on the inside. Regret often doesn't hit like a dramatic scene. It shows up quietly. It comes in moments when he's lying next to someone and still feels alone. When he hears your voice in his memory and it hits him how rare your presence really was. When he sees you moving on, glowing in your own life, becoming even more of the woman he couldn't handle and now can't replace. He begins to understand that true connection isn't about finding someone who looks good in pictures or says all the right lines. It's about being with someone who sees into your soul and stays anyway. Someone who gets your chaos and still believes in your calm. And when he finally sees the difference between what he wanted and what he needed, the regret doesn't just sting, it stays. Because he chased the temporary and in doing so, lost something timeless. Regret doesn't always show up right away. For some people, especially men who aren't yet emotionally mature, the impact of their decisions doesn't sink in until much later, until they've grown enough to actually feel what they once ignored. When he let you go, he might have felt fine. He might have believed he was making the right choice, or at the very least, a harmless one. Maybe he told himself it just wasn't the right time. Maybe he thought he needed to explore more, experience more, keep things light. He didn't realize that growth would eventually bring clarity, and with that clarity would come the weight of what he lost. At the time, he wasn't ready for someone like you. You offered real connection, vulnerability, and emotional depth. Things that sounded good in theory, but in reality required him to meet you at the same level, and he couldn't. Not because you were too much, but because he hadn't yet developed the capacity to be with someone who saw him so clearly. You weren't interested in surface-level games. You wanted honesty, partnership, emotional safety. To him, that might have felt overwhelming, maybe even threatening, because it forced him to look at himself in ways he wasn't prepared to. So he walked away, or he let it fade. And for a while, he didn't feel much of anything about it. He distracted himself. He filled the silence with noise, people, moments that felt exciting but ultimately empty. He might have even told himself that if you were really the one, he wouldn't have felt so unsure, but that logic doesn't hold up over time. Because sometimes people don't feel the weight of a meaningful connection until they've grown enough to understand what it actually meant. Growth changes everything. With time, he started to see love differently. He began to realize that relationships aren't just about having fun or avoiding pain. They're about building something real with someone who meets you with honesty and heart. And as he matured, he started to crave the very things you once offered. Conversation with depth, love with intention, support that doesn't have to be earned. But by then you were gone, not because you didn't love him, but because you loved yourself enough not to wait. This is when regret begins to hit. Slowly but deeply, he starts replaying memories, not just because he misses you, but because he finally understands what you were trying to give him, the texts that went unanswered, the questions you asked that he avoided, the emotional space you held for him, even when he couldn't do the same for you. All of it starts to take on new meaning now that he's seeing through a clearer lens. And it hurts not just because he lost you, but because he sees how avoidable it was. He didn't lose you to fate or timing. He lost you because he wasn't ready and you were. Regret isn't just about wishing things were different. It's about seeing how much better things could have been if he had only been capable of showing up fully, if he had allowed himself to grow sooner, if he had chosen courage over comfort. But life doesn't work in reverse. Once you've healed, grown, and moved on, that chapter becomes closed, no matter how much he wants to revisit it. And that's where the pain lives, not just in the loss of you, but in the knowledge that when the time finally came for him to be ready, the moment had already passed. The moment he starts to feel the full weight of his regret isn't when you first walk away. It's when he realizes you're no longer available to him, emotionally, mentally, maybe even physically. You're no longer waiting, no longer checking in, no longer lingering in his world. That's when it really hits. Because in the back of his mind, he always thought you'd be there. He believed, maybe subconsciously, that if things didn't work out elsewhere, if he ever changed his mind or matured a little, he could come back and you'd still be open to him. That's the illusion he lived in, the comfort of knowing you hadn't fully closed the door. But then something shifts. Maybe you meet someone new, maybe you stop replying to his messages, maybe he sees you living your life in full color, smiling, growing, glowing in a way you never did when you were wrapped up in waiting for him. And in that moment, he doesn't just miss you, he realizes he lost you. Not just in a technical, we're no longer talking kind of way, but in the soul deep, she's not mine anymore kind of way. That's when it stings, because it's not just about you moving on, it's about the fact that you're finally unavailable to him. When you were emotionally invested, you showed up with your whole heart. You were open, loving, patient. You gave him room to grow, chances to meet you where you were. And even when he didn't rise to meet you, a part of you still held on to the hope that maybe one day he would. That kind of emotional availability is powerful and rare, but it's also exhausting. There comes a point where giving without receiving back in equal measure becomes too heavy to carry. That's when you begin to detach, not out of anger, but out of self-respect. He might not notice the shift at first. He might even assume you're just giving him space, playing it cool, or trying a new tactic. But eventually it becomes undeniable. Your energy is gone. You're no longer reacting to him, no longer orbiting around his indecision. You're living your life fully, without looking over your shoulder to see if he's catching up. And that's when he panics. Not necessarily outwardly, but inside. Because now he feels the absence of your presence. And the realization that he doesn't have access to you anymore brings a level of regret he wasn't prepared for. This is the power of emotional unavailability. Not in a cold, distant way, but in the empowered sense of no longer offering yourself to someone who didn't value you when it mattered. It's in your silence, in your happiness, in your peace. He begins to understand that what he lost wasn't just a woman who cared about him. It was someone who had the capacity to love him at a depth most people never reach. And now that depth is no longer available to him. It's a painful realization, but it's also a necessary one, because part of truly growing up, emotionally and relationally, is understanding that not everyone will wait for you to catch up. You can't put love on pause and expect it to stay in the same place. And when the person you once took for granted becomes someone you can no longer reach, it forces you to face yourself, to see what your fear, avoidance, or indecision really cost you. Not just a person, but the version of yourself you could have become alongside them. And that's the kind of regret that doesn't just visit, it stays. You weren't the mistake, you were the lesson. That's what he eventually comes to understand. Not right away, and maybe not even during the first wave of regret, but over time, as life unfolds and he continues to encounter people who don't quite reach the same level of depth, warmth, or authenticity, the truth sets in. You were different. And not just in a fleeting, romanticized way, but in the kind of way that leaves a lasting mark. You were the one who challenged him to be better, to open up, to show up. And while he didn't choose you, you became the benchmark by which he quietly measures every connection that came after. He may have told himself at the time that it wasn't right, that the timing was off, that you were too intense, too emotional, or too much. But what he was really saying was that he wasn't ready for the version of himself he would have had to become to love you properly. You asked for things, honesty, vulnerability, effort, that he didn't know how to give yet. You reflected back to him all the places where he still needed to grow, and instead of stepping up, he stepped away. Not because you were wrong for him, but because he hadn't yet become the kind of man who could meet you where you were. And what he didn't realize is that some people come into our lives not to stay, but to awaken us, to hold a mirror up to us and show us what we're capable of, what we crave and what we fear. You were that mirror. And at the time, he looked away. He took the easier road, the familiar path, the one that didn't require as much inner work. And for a while, that worked. He could stay comfortable, unchallenged, emotionally detached. But growth has a way of creeping in, and eventually he starts to see the cracks. Not in you, but in himself. You didn't break him. You didn't hurt him. You taught him. You showed him what it feels like to be seen and still accepted. What it means to have someone who actually listens, who actually cares, not because it's convenient, but because it's real. And when you left, whether gently or abruptly, he was forced to sit with the echo of what used to be. That silence taught him more than any argument ever could. At first, he might have seen your absence as a loss, but later he understands it as the turning point, the beginning of a deeper self-awareness. He starts to recognize the patterns, how he avoids intimacy, how he runs from emotional responsibility, how he chooses people who require less of him because he doesn't want to confront what more would ask of him. And in doing so, he finally sees what you were offering wasn't pressure, it was love. A love that required him to show up fully, a love that didn't let him hide. You became the lesson that changed him, the one that shaped his standards, his emotional language, and maybe even the way he treats others. And sure, someone else might benefit from that growth, but you were the catalyst, you were the reason he evolved. And the irony is, he had everything he needed when he had you, but he couldn't recognize it, not until you became the one that couldn't be unforgotten. There's a certain kind of regret that doesn't come from losing someone perfect. It comes from realizing you had someone real, someone willing to walk with you through your mess and still believe in your future, and you let them go. That kind of lesson lingers, and even if he moves forward, a part of him will always look back, not because he didn't move on, but because he knows he didn't choose right when it really mattered. It wasn't just a wrong choice, it was a turning point. He realized too late that every decision carves a path, and once you're too far down, turning back comes at a price. His regret wasn't just about what he lost, but about what he could have become had he chosen differently. Let his story be a reminder to all of us. Don't wait for regret to wake you up. Think deeper, choose wiser, because sometimes the weight of one wrong choice can echo for a lifetime.